Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Daniel, for having me, and Lassie, and the organizers for the Finnish Institute for hosting our meeting. This wonderful venue. The presentation today carries this title, Hexis or Pathos, Continuity and Repetition, Aristotle, Parva, Naturalia, and it's perhaps too ambitious and at the same time too specific for the kind of general remarks I'd like to share with you today. But hopefully some of the thematic connections will become clear as I talk, and we can discuss them during the Q&A. So, taking life as the central topic for philosophical examination can be done, so to speak, directly or indirectly. Directly by turning to concrete life and living experience as we find it, right in front of us, around us, in us, as it proceeds, so to speak, in the world. Or rather, more indirectly, that is by questioning precisely this life in the world as a field of differentiation, continuity, coherence, which is the living situation one finds oneself already in, and from which one has no choice but to begin in order to perform any investigation, any conceptual probing of life. And this is also how I would like to interpret today the very title of our conference. Then this double questioning of life may intriguingly correspond respectively to the way Aristotle and the philosophy of life took up the investigation of life. And so at the center of my talk, there is a substantive concern with a methodological issue in the investigation, in relation to the investigation of life. So that I think that this connection of Aristotle and life philosophy is not just an exercise in syncretism, but it points to an actual problem. And I'm going to try to work my way to this problem and this question with you, which I can maybe summarize very briefly by saying, what is the meaning and the implication of taking life all the way down to the roots, all the way down to the bottom? What does it mean to do that? As I think the philosophy of life aims to do. Otherwise it wouldn't be called philosophy of life. I would like to begin with some general remarks that aim to introduce the issue, however, that I'd like to address. If we were to characterize the basic feature of life philosophy in most general terms, perhaps we could use the term topical reflection, which takes the world. What is this topical reflection? It's a reflection that takes the world in its concrete features as the grounding contextual topos, or situation, for reflection. And the principal such concrete feature is life. That is, any reflection and analysis takes place in a living context that is already going on when reflection begins. The philosophy of life, in other words, establishes a fundamental relationship or contact or rootedness between mind and world. This general trajectory, which continues today in various ways and formulations, emerges as a concerted response, as Yanivad had wonderfully illustrated yesterday, to the well-known modern tendency to focus on the subject as variously wordless, in fact, lifeless. If life is taken to have anything to do with some embeddedness of existence in a nature and in a history. In his Mind and World, John McDowell has indeed spoken of an underlying philosophical anxiety of modern intellectual efforts, always perplexed about the possibility of a thought that is out of touch with the world. So how may one respond to this anxiety? Well, there is many ways to respond to this anxiety, but let me just offer a couple of options, starting with a very paradigmatic one. Think about Nietzsche's little fable, little story at the beginning of this short text on truth and lie in an extramoral sense. And what we see here is a dramatic reaction precisely to this tendency to separate mind and world. And what is Nietzsche doing here? If you are familiar with this little story at the beginning of this short text, what happens here is this. The mind is a short moment in the life of nature. From the point of view of nature, human life is utterly, and for that matter, any life, is utterly indifferent. It lasts for a brief minute and then disappears into natural uniformity, which is a repetitive character, an indifferent character. However, while this is a text on truth and a text with the title Truth and Lie in an Extramoral Sense, it is a moral teaching. And what is the moral teaching? Namely, this is a teaching about the arrogance and deceptiveness of human intelligence and human life regarding its own spatial worth, and thus alleged separation from the rest of nature. Okay, is Nietzsche a naturalist? Well, I'm not going to address this question here. It's a complex question. I'm just referring to this very brief story to indicate a general approach that is actually still quite prominent today in the study of life and nature, that is, we can designate as a sort of anti-humanistic naturalism. So it just should be an example. I'm not saying Nietzsche defends necessarily this anti-humanistic naturalism, but the little story it tells can be taken as a paradigmatic example. Okay, this will be one option to resolve the tension between the mind and world as separate as. What would be another option? Well, another way to respond to the anxiety about a thought that is disconnected from the world would be that, for instance, of John McDowell himself. And hopefully no one is shocked that I'm going to linger for a second on McDowell. Perhaps the reference, after few remarks, will look less estranging in the context of a conference on life philosophy. So I'd like to refer to McDowell because perhaps we find in his text, in the most compressed form, what is the underlying thesis of life philosophy. And this thesis will sound like this. Experience is passive. Life implies an undergoing something. It is an affective sort of life for this to be called life at all. This thesis emphasizes, if you will, the pathic, what we can call the pathic ground of living experience, or Bernard Badenfeld's, who called this a Welthaftigkeit, that is intrinsic to life and living experience. In a minimal sense of this passive experience, it is only to entail, again with McDowell, this is the second quote, it just has to entail, to put it very simply, the idea that one's control over what happens in experience has limits. It is not up to one what one will experience. Very simply. Now, there is a strong point here in McDowell's thesis about the situatedness of the mind in the world, in contrast to what McDowell calls a rampant Platonism. His proposal now, you're going to see it's different than the anti-humanistic naturalism that I referred to at the beginning. His proposal is rather that of a naturalizing Platonism. The proposal to reintegrate reason with nature is rather based here on this naturalized Platonism, conceiving human beings as equipped with a second nature, which is effectively meant to rehabilitate the idea of a bodily presence in the world, in McDowell's intentions, without, at the same time, sacrificing anything about the spontaneity of the understanding, which McDowell takes in the Kantian sense of the conceptual capacity, the power of conceptual thinking as the ability to engage in conceptually articulated thought, recording how things are in the world, the possibility or the capacity to give reasons for beliefs and actions. And here's a couple of excerpts about this idea of a spontaneity of the understanding. But what McDowell, however, does by taking up the Aristotelian notion of second nature is precisely aimed to avoid, as he says, the idea, and here is a Kantian reference, the idea of a subjectively continuous series of representations, which, as he writes, could no more stand alone, independent of the idea of a living thing in whose life these events occur, than could the idea of a series of digestive events with its appropriate kind of continuity. But at the same time, and this is really McDowell's point, and this is the second quote on the screen here, his real point is to say that our second nature is the way it is, not just because of the potentialities we were born with, but also because of our upbringing, our Bildung. So maybe now the reference to life philosophy and a certain tradition slowly becomes a little more clear. This reference to the idea of second nature aims to articulate the very living initiation. It's a living initiation into what McDowell calls a space of reasons that accompanies human enculturation as something fully natural. We are naturally cultural, in other words. But not restricted, the second nature here is not restricted to nature as the realm of natural law, the realm that is studied by, if you will, the hard sciences, and physics, etc. So, okay, the merit of this point now that McDowell is making about reviving, rehabilitating this idea of second nature is that it attempts to bring into view the full image of a living human being as a being with second nature, as a being with history, as a being with language, endowed with a tradition, as a being who is in touch with the world, inhabiting a world that is distinctively cultural. And now, it's not really the last or the least interesting aspect of McDowell's plea for embodied meaning that he draws from Hans-Georg Gadamer. And in fact, the whole book ends with a footnote mentioning the concept of tradition and Gadamer explicitly. And so, perhaps, allow me again, for the sake of argument, to see here perhaps an indirect, more or less indirect, contact with a tradition that is heavily indebted to a certain trajectory of the philosophy of life as a diffused orientation that was still prominent in the first decades of the 20th century in Germany, still in the 1930s. Okay, McDowell's position centered around the idea of life in the world as essentially historical life, okay, is, in fact, one of life philosophy's major achievements. Namely, its emphasis upon the culture-building capability of spirit in endless manifold change through history. Okay, this achievement of the philosophy of life, perhaps you might have noticed I'm referring to a certain trajectory of the philosophy of life that goes back to the originator of the historical school. Perhaps you might think about Wittgenstein. This achievement, focusing on the life of the second nature as historical and cultural, I think is crucial, especially in the aftermath and in the wake of the theory of evolution and the theory of organic evolution, which is tended to assimilate precisely historical development to organic development, so that historical development becomes a sub-phenomenon of organic evolution, with all the various ways to then develop this, thinking about the state as an organic being, and however, now I would like to raise a critical question that will lead us to Aristotle. Let me call this universal historicism, which surely places life in the world as this historical, cultural life, as a repository of tradition, where we are just born into, initiated, raises the question whether life philosophy can establish the proper orientation for explicating life fundamentally. And this is my main interest here, my main point ultimately, and the interest in turning to Aristotle. Can this approach in life philosophy, this historical approach to life, in life philosophy, establish the proper orientation for explicating life in its radical originating power and comprehensiveness? And the argument is just this, for the sake of argument, I'm just going to point out, try to get the point across here. According to this perspective, human lived experience is brought into focus by way of the mode of cognition of the sciences of the spirit, that is, the understanding. Established in methodological autonomy, in contrast to the mode of cognition and methodology of the sciences of nature. In so doing, however, understanding, as the organon of life philosophy, in its aim for the self-comprehension of life, adopts a schema that is set within the parameters of a finite being within the world. That is, it focuses on a part of life in the world. Let me call this spirit life. So the life is accordingly conceived in terms of the phenomenon of meaning, Bedeutung, for instance, or the space of reasons in the more recent take of McDowell, for instance. Okay, so the description of a kind of naturalism, therefore, that reconciliates nature and meaning in this theory of second nature as the proper domain of life in the world does not diminish the fact that in the very notion of nature there remains a residue that resists becoming meaningful in a full-blooded, so to speak, human, spiritual sense. Something that should be interpreted in other terms than meaning. Otherwise, it would not make any sense to call it nature. Where is nature in second nature? What is left of nature in second nature, as also Jocelyn Benoist actually raised this issue in relation precisely to McDowell's approach. So, I'd like to turn now at this juncture to Aristotle, because at this point I'd like to suggest that the interest in Aristotle's treatment of life remains quite relevant for explicating issues and findings at the heart of the enterprise to account for the essence of life in its manifold capacity and its truly grounding phenomenon. How does Aristotle do this? Well, I'm going to be rather schematic. I'm not going to go into too many details. I just want to bring out the main points, okay, and then get to my conclusions. So let me get to it. Especially focus on some excerpts from the De Anima and the Parva Naturalia. The accounts of the Parva Naturalia are especially interesting in this context of discussion about life, for their emphasis on embodiment. And this ties with the overall program launched in the De Anima, as you can see from these two passages, which tie together. They outline a full program focused on the study of life. What this means, what you see here, is that the Parva Naturalia, by considering more fully the relation of the soul with the body continues, supports, and integrates the account of the anima by looking at the attributes that living beings have from being and soul, empsikon. And so, throughout the anima, Aristotle, as we also heard yesterday in the presentation of Professor Rangus, returns repeatedly to two criteria of being and soul, namely perceiving and motion. Now, what this tells us is essentially this, that sense perceiving and moving are important to account for what it means for something or someone to be in the world. In Aristotle, this discussion now is essentially oriented around the problem of the individuality of the living being, of this particular living being, or we can call the todeti. And what do we observe? Well, first, the life is and becomes manifest as essentially movemental. There is a certain also transitive character of life, that is, life is involved with things as if centrifugally. But we notice also that in all of this movement of life, there is the life of this particular living being, which keeps on going on, living. This was the issue that Yanivar addressed yesterday about stability. The way in which Aristotle attempts to articulate now the unity, essentially, of motion and rest, of flowing and stability, that must characterize any living this, is by referring to the reciprocity, potentiality, and actuality. So, let us just take a brief look at the Anima, Book 2, Chapter 5. At this point, Aristotle explicitly refers to the doctrine of potentiality and actuality to speak about perception. And then he says perception can be said in two ways. You can have either perception as a not occurring process, but perhaps ready to be realized and actualized, or perception as an occurring event, so actualized. And then he's going to do something else here. He says, what he does is to use the term Hexis in 417a32 in relation to the power of perception and the process of gaining knowledge. In fact, in this very passage, Aristotle uses the example of knowledge to qualify his application of the doctrine of potentiality and actuality. And as again was what Professor Rangus explained yesterday. Here you find Aristotle actually articulating this series of distinctions between primary potentiality, secondary potentiality, first actuality, and then secondary actuality. Because he says, like, I've been using this distinction, potentiality and actuality, in an unqualified way, and then he uses the example of knowledge to qualify his usage, and then we get all these distinctions. But he's doing this in the context of trying to explain perception. Hexis, as we know, can be translated as habit, state, condition, disposition, etc. And as we know, as emphasized in the ethical works, habits and dispositions develop through practice and habituation, and this just means that we do something again and again, that is, time after time. As Aristotle actually formulates this, we change from a contrary condition. And what happens is, for instance, in the case of knowledge, we learn. We change from the contrary condition of ignorance again and again, and what happens is that we learn. So strictly, however, and this is now going to be the main point and my main premise before I get to the conclusions. this transition is not an alteration. It's not a change in the strict sense. For Aristotle, a change and an alteration in the strict sense is applied precisely to pathé, to the sensible affections. And what happens there? Well, change in the strict sense shows that a sensible affection takes the place of its contrary. And Aristotle, in fact, would formulate this, describe this as a sort of destruction. Alteration is a form of replacement and destruction. But in the case of the development of a hexis of soul, perception, knowledge, ultimately living itself, we don't have alteration. There is no destruction going on. There is no replacement of something by its contrary, but a development into what is natural for the living thing. The fulfillment of the very nature here hardly counts as a destruction, and thus it should not be called an alteration. In fact, Aristotle has a way to speak about this when he says, for instance, for perception, that perception is a sort of alteration. Aloios estis. It doesn't say it's an alteration, it's a sort. An alteration of a sort. Okay, why that is doing that? Well, I take here the thesis by Ronald Polanski, who really emphasizes this in his 2007 commentary on the De Anima and the 2024 commentary, recent commentary on the Parva Naturalia. Essentially that Aristotle has activity. So Aristotle was beautiful illustrated yesterday. Aristotle has activity, energia, really, as in distinction from motion, playing the key role in accounting for life. But we have to be mindful here because in the context of physics or natural science, it seems that activity is somewhat out of place. Why? Because in physics, what are we studying there? Nature as the inner principle of motion and rest. And soul, as the study of the soul, as part of natural science, is the inner principle of motion and rest of, say, that's not my interest here, mortal living beings. So the soul should be the principle of motion rather than activity. But Aristotle then has to speak of some activity as alteration of a sort, just to keep the study of life within natural science, otherwise we get into too complex territory that starts to be going outside of natural science as soon as we start to talk about energy and activity. So Aristotle is very careful about the division of the sciences, but he is also flexible enough to integrate conceptuality from various fields to try to describe as accurately as possible and as comprehensively as possible what he's trying to study. I was trying now to get quite speedily here, but this is kind of the main thesis that life is activity. Okay, and Aristotle takes this in distinction from motion, though motion is clearly involved in life and activity in the living being. Motions are involved in the living being, but life is activity. That's the thesis. So I'm going to just highlight two elements, again, very broad, very general, that I'm taking as implications of this idea in reference to some statements by Aristotle in the Parva Naturalia, and then I get to my conclusions. The first element is that way Aristotle analyzes sense powers in terms of what I would call a world openness, or sense spatiality, that is in terms of a field or horizon structure of living perception. So perception is activity, but it is an activity that is essentially receptive. And that's indicated by the idea of the decticon. So perception is activity, but is essentially receptive, and so fully integrated with the content of perception. And now this is certainly a complex matter that cannot, and I will not fully explore here. But let me just point to an especially striking instance of this integrative standpoint, which brings perception in full integration with the content of perception, with a surrounding, with a world, okay? For instance, in the sensu, Aristotle discusses perception as capacity to perceive more things at once. So perception doesn't just have to be what it is, the character of perceiving an identity, something stable in the changing circumstances. No. For the animal, it's crucial to be able to perceive more things, to identify more things at once. Animal life is fostered by the capacity of perception to be discriminative and critical. Now, one main element of this account, which Aristotle explores and expands in the Parva Naturalia, already mentioned, however, in the De Anima, is having sense perception be integrated with a sense medium. I put here, I guess, a very tentative way to illustrate this. You can help me to correct as if anything is inaccurate. The medium for sense perception and actually also the sense organ, those are bodies for Aristotle. But they're not, and this is the important point, they're not just sheerly physical bodies, say in the way we might think about bodies in modern physics. Because they're unusual kind of bodies. Because they have a connection with perception. They're integrated with sense perceiving. The medium and the sense organ as capacities are capacities to be acted upon by the sensible object, but in such a way that the capacity for sensitivity is saved, is preserved, is continued. Otherwise we wouldn't be able to get to things as they are. That's clearly the case for Aristotle. We get to perceive things as they are. We don't get to have representations of things. We get to actually perceive the things themselves. So the medium and the sense organ have to, for Aristotle, have to have this peculiar character. Again, kind of alteration. They undergo a kind of alteration, but it's not quite the motion, the strict kind of alteration that implies destruction and replacement, etc. No, it's a continuity here, a saving. Also, that's the way Aristotle formulates the idea of soteria. Okay, the point here is that living activity is fully integrated with nature. Okay, that's kind of the general point. Aristotle is presenting us the picture essentially of this dynamic of living, of the living being, embracing together. Try to think about this in contrast to the more modern tendencies as illustrated by Yanibai yesterday. Aristotle is giving us the image, this account of a dynamic of living being, embracing together in one operational identity, both what we would call it spirit. That is this opening to being, this opening to the world in the concreteness of sensibility. At the same time, however, we also have a fundamental characteristic of nature, namely the material itselfness of a natural entity is perceived, experienced, which is irreducible to arbitrary wants of the subject. So nature here, for Aristotle, is pre-given, but not in the material physicalistic sense. However, also not as already shot through with full-blooded meaning, as in the theory of second nature. That would be my suggestion. So I like to propose that a careful delineation of this primordial situation of experience, of the character of this primordial situation in which we as living beings do access the world, the reality around us, as it becomes manifest, should be really relevant for our conception such as that of second nature. Okay, but then it's really now a second element. This was the first, is fundamental integration of perceiving and content of perception as really being the way in which we get to access an environment, a world, perhaps. I can say world. But there's another element that I like to point out before getting to my conclusion, because this other element is so fundamental. And Aristotle raises this issue in connection with a revealing perplexity in the chapter 7 of the Sensu, in relation to the capacity precisely to perceive several things at once, to have discriminative awareness of several, many things or multiple things at once, he says, during the same time. So, this gives us a hint, a link to the question of time and temporality, and I'm just going to mention this very briefly, but the discussion in the Sensu 7 prepares for the treatment of time sense in the last part of the Memoria, but also important for the account of the whole motion of living being in the motu animalium. Memory clearly deals with time, deals with how one presently gets to what is not now, or not merely now. And desire is a key element for Aristotle to explain animal motion in the comprehensive living context of a desired project. And desire seeks something not currently present for the animal, or not presently present in the suitable way. So the animal has to move and go and get it. Another couple of passages. As I said, I'm just going to move kind of swiftly. Okay, what this ultimately points to is that all cognition, here in the broad sense, perception included, and motion connect to the temporal life of the mortal living being, involving past, present, and future. And now, again, I want to highlight this thesis, which I'm just trying to capture in a few points, that I take from Ronald Polanski, who presents the case for a fundamental temporality characterizing life, especially animal life. And the case presented is this, so I'm just going to try to say a couple of things about this and then get to my conclusion. Okay, mortal living beings have a more ordinary temporality as bodily beings in motion. So their temporal life as living beings, that is, as we saw, having activity always complete at each moment, with its end always in itself, is a perfection and a fulfillment of a dispositional capacity, cannot simply be this kind of temporality. For Aristotle, time presupposes motion, and in Physics, Book 4, Chapter 11, time is a measure of motion. And motion is incomplete actuality and ageatis. With its end beyond itself, motion is always suicidal. It's always about to terminate itself as motion, right? So it should be concluded that activity involved in the exercise of living capacities and the activity of mortal living beings is not strictly in time. in the sense of this ordinary temporality of motion. There must be another way to speak of the temporality of activity, which is complete, but continuable. So I found very intriguing the connection or the discussion about entelecheia and endelecheia, because these two terms bring in a way together precisely this concept of activity as complete at each moment and yet continuable. So there is a time of activity, but it's not the ordinary time, the time that is measured by of motion. And Aristotle has a way to speak about, according to Polanski, there is a way that Aristotle has to speak about this fundamental, deeper temporality. Because activity is always, as he called it, a tripartite structure. Plant or animal life, living, always has a projective futural aspect in its end. The very activities, the present aspect. And then the circumstances, the pre-given circumstances, are the past aspect. And all of this is tightly unified, it's complete, in a complete unity. Okay. This is kind of illustrated in the 3 points here on the slide. And I'll come to the last brief comment I want to conclude with. We see here Aristotle taking life all the way down to the ground, to its roots, as activity, as a fundamental temporality, as in this sense-rich, intentionality structured orientation within a world. Okay, what emerges in the thesis can be summarized by saying that Aristotle gives us essentially a description of life's cosmological fact. There is a forgiveness of the world in the richness of detail, coherence, ongoing differentiation, right from the outset of living, sensible manifestation of the world. But now there is an issue. This inquiry into life and living beings, all the way down to the bottom of this spatial, temporal structuring, which is really the appearance of the world. Aristotle is giving us the basic, fundamental conditions for the appearance of a world in his description of life. Then there's an issue, however, which I would like to raise here. There's a serious problem. Because if life is taken in this, in its all conditioning force, if we take life really all the way down on its bottommost level of this temporal spatial structuring of a world, in which living being is already temporalized and spatialized as soon as it begins to live, then, and this is the conclusion, life's coming about as such is not something that takes place in terms of features that occur within this experiential horizon, as going on already in time. As a result, one cannot take the phenomenon of life as it appears within the world as the authentic, ultimate manifestation of originative life itself. How could it be? How can we use the terms that we use to describe life in the world to describe the life that gives rise precisely to the appearance of a world? But that's what life philosophy intends to put forward. And yet there's no other way for us to approach fundamental life, or life all the way down to the roots, to the bottom, other than through mundane life, the life that we actually access, that we actually see, that we actually study. And so we have a paradox here. There's a fundamental paradox in the study of life, and this is what I'm concluding with. That life philosophy is essentially unrealizable, is unfinished. And so, really, a brief comment is, I like to at least present an instance, a case, of someone who might have been aware of this issue, of this question, which I find especially interesting because it comes from within biology. And I want to refer to Adolf Portman then, just quickly. I'm not going to really get into this too much. Just to show you that Adolf Portman seems to be quite aware of this methodological issue in accessing life, in understanding life, in studying life. And so I'm just going to refer to the introduction and conclusion of this very small text here, which actually has the original title is Biologische Fragmente zu einer Lehre vom Menschen, translated as A Zoologist Looks at Humankind. Those are biological fragments, if you will, to the study of human being. Portman is aware that there's not a way for us to access life than through our own living experience. How otherwise should we start to study life? Aristotle is a prime example of this, in the way he uses various strategies in accessing certain phenomena by what is more accessible to us, to get to what is more understandable and intelligible in itself. And yet, especially in critique, in rigorous critique of the theory of evolution, which Portman doesn't reject, he's a biologist, but qualifies. Portman also realizes that the proper appreciation of the study of life requires an awareness about the paradoxicality to study life, to give full articulation to life as a whole, which therefore has to remain irrevocably invisible or imperceptible, maybe. And so I'd like to conclude by referring to this brief statement by Taillade de Chardin, who applied this to the human being, and he said something like, the human being came in without a sound, but maybe we can apply this to life itself. Life came in without a sound. Thank you very much.